Good afternoon, everyone. I believe we are live now on YouTube. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. We had the first session sometime last week, able to introduce the series, what we'll be doing, and we had a great panel being represented by Trace Kenya and Tangaza University. Today we have the second session looking at the series that we'll be having, focusing on child trafficking. And to guide through our discussion today, I'll be guiding as the moderator, Winnie Mutebu from Heart Kenya, joined by a great panel. Happy to be able to introduce each one of them. But I think as we begin, I'd just like to welcome everyone for today's session. Depending on where you are, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. As we continue, I'll ask the participants to be able to introduce themselves through the chat box. If you have any questions, feel free to raise your questions through the chat box. We'll be able to respond to your questions. And then as we proceed, those of us who are joining through YouTube, through Facebook, feel free to ask your questions, to contribute, to give feedback. And yes, if you want to be able to have a conversation online, the hashtag is Fight Human Trafficking. And we want to share the different organizations joining us today for us to be able to tag them in the discussion. I think without any further ado, I'd like to jump straight in and have the introductions of the team that is joining us. And I'll begin with Grace Banya. Grace, I think she can wave. I see three ladies in spectacles for us to know who I'll be introducing now. So Grace Banya is a manager of a regional project that covers Kenya, Uganda, and the East African Community Secretariat. The project, codenamed CAPSA, short for Strengthening Capacities of Governments, Workers, Employers, CSOs, and other stakeholders to address child labor, forced labor, human trafficking, and violations of labor standards at work, such as hours of work, wages, and safety and health issues. Her background is a BA degree in political science and international relations, a Master's of Arts degree in politics and governance from the University of London. She has over 18 years experience working on children, youth, and women's rights. She's worked with UNICEF, UN Women, the ILO, and she has worked at least in over 10 countries in Africa, including Uganda, Kenya, Rwanda, Tanzania, South Africa, Botswana, Swaziland, Namibia, Zimbabwe, and South Sudan. So looking at the continent, we are well covered, looking at the vast experience that Grace has. And today she represents ILO as the program manager for the CAPSA project. Thank you very much, Grace, for joining us.
Thank you, Winnie, and thank you for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here with this great team of panelists, Rachel, Michelle, Mr. Gitau, and of course, moderated by Winnie. Thank you. Like Winnie has introduced me, I had a project that is based here in Nairobi, but covering Kenya, but also Uganda and aspects of the East African Community Secretariat. So we cover a sub-regional program that is addressing child labor, human trafficking, and forced labor. And what a time to discuss the issues of trafficking during the week-long when we are focused on child labor. And as you all know, this year has been designated the International Year on Elimination of Child Labor by the UN Secretary General. And this year we have a number of activities that will be involved in. I'm sure we'll invite all of you to join us as we commemorate the World Day Against Child Labor on the 12th of June, and also going through the whole year towards the end, up to the end of December 2021. And this year's World Day Against Child Labor actually comes at a time when we are also working towards or looking forward to the 5th Global Conference on Child Labor that will be hosted by South Africa, the government of South Africa in Durban. So there's quite a lot that we'll share as we go along, because as you know, there's a very thin line between child labor and trafficking. And I think that's what I was asked to talk about. So I stop it here and wait to hear from others. Thank you. Thank you very much, Winnie.
Thank you very much, Grace, and for the brief overview as well. I'd like to be able to also introduce our other panelist, who is Michelle Oliel. Michelle, if you could have the camera on, just wave to the audience for them to know who Michelle is. Thank you, Michelle. So Michelle is the Executive Director at Stahili Foundation. She's also a Deputy Director at Lori E. Tulsi Center for Human Rights of Women and Children at Michigan State University College of Law. Michelle is a human rights lawyer, investigator, child protection specialist with extensive experience working on the issue of orphanage trafficking and the recruitment and use of children. Michelle serves as the executive director of the Stahili Foundation, an governmental organization in Kenya that works to end child trafficking, orphanages, and supports the government's efforts to change care systems for children. She's also currently the deputy director of the Tulsi Center for Human Rights of Women and Children at Michigan State University College of Law. As we mentioned, she has worked for a number of UN and UN-related agencies, as well as with NGOs to develop and enhance accountability for crimes committed against children in a number of country contexts. And so again, looking at the experience that we're able to have today within our panel, thank you very much, Michelle, for joining us, and welcome for the panel. I'd like to jump on and introduce our other panelist, who is Rachel Ngumi. Rachel is an advocate of the High Court of Kenya with a passion in human rights, law, and advocacy. She has worked in various organizations by providing legal services and assisting those who are vulnerable and marginalized to access justice and reclaim their rights. She has also worked in the Legal, Social Justice, and Protection Department by providing legal services to refugees and other forced migrants. Furthermore, she has taken up various tasks and roles in providing awareness to the plight of those who are vulnerable through advocacy. Rachel Ngumi is the current legal officer at Heart Kenya. Karibu sana, Rachel. Maybe just wave to know who is Rachel. Thank you very much, Rachel. And then lastly, in our panel, we have David Murunyu Gitau. David is a detective constable who has worked with the Directorate of Criminal Investigations for 6 years. He joined the National Police Service in 2015 and got attached to the Directorate of Criminal Investigations in 2016. He served as a General Investigations Officer before moving to the Anti-Human Trafficking and Child Protection Unit in 2019, where he has specialized in conducting investigations involving human trafficking, online child abuse, and sexual exploitation. David holds a Master's of Arts Migration, Organized Crime and Human Trafficking from St. Mary's University in London, and a bachelor's degree in sociology from the University of Nairobi. Thank you very much, David Gitau, for joining us. Maybe you could wave for the audience to know who is David Gitau. And he's the only gentleman who gets to join us in this discussion, and looking at David's experience and Michelle's experience in the investigations, having Rachel's experience looking at the legal framework and the perspective, and also having Grace's experience, the regional level looking at child labor issues. I think we should be able to have a very productive discussion. I welcome everyone who is joining us today to be able to utilize this platform and really be able to interact and ask as many questions for you to be able to understand the issue of child trafficking even more. I think I'd like to request for us to be able to proceed with the discussion for the day, and would like to request Madam Grace to lead us by giving us a brief overview on what is child trafficking, and then we're able to kick it off from there with the panel discussion. Welcome, Grace.
Hey, thank you very much, Winnie. Can you put up the presentation?
Yes. IT team in the background, we can have the presentation.
Are you able to make the screen a bit wider? Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you again, Winnie and fellow panelists. I'll just go quickly through this. I don't intend to spend long, but I put up the various protocols as the start of my presentation to give you an idea or to share where the whole issue of trafficking, human trafficking, as well as child trafficking is anchored. So we are looking at the United Nations Convention Against Transnational and Organized Crime, which is known commonly as the Palermo Convention of 2000, and then the various protocols that support the Palermo Convention. The protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons, especially women and children, of 2002. That was followed by the protocol against the smuggling of migrants by land, sea, and air, which also usually takes care of the same target group, who are usually women and children. And I'm sure you've seen a lot of information that we see on TV where so-called migrant workers are smuggled on boats, and usually they are full of women and children. Then the protocol against the illicit manufacturing and trafficking in firearms, again, that also supports the Palermo Convention. Can we move on to the next slide? So in terms of child trafficking, I know that at Kenya, you work on trafficking, and therefore I think most of us on this panel discussion would have an idea what trafficking is. But just for the purpose of this discussion, I'll just quickly say that child trafficking is about taking children out of their protective environment and preying on their vulnerability for the purpose of exploitation. Although, according to the ILO, we do not necessarily have precise figures, as of 2005, which of course is an old statistic, it was estimated that 980,000 to about 1.2 to 1,225,000 children, both boys and girls, are in a forced labor situation as a result of trafficking. So therefore, like I mentioned earlier, child labor and trafficking, as well as forced labor, there's very thin, you cannot actually disidentify each from one another. In other words, the whole labor situation and exploitation of children is really a lot of the time as a result of trafficking. And can I have the next slide? It's a bit difficult not to be able to do it myself. So we look at ILO Convention number 182 of 1999 on the worst forms of child labor. It classifies trafficking among forms of slavery or practices similar to slavery, and thereby they become worse forms of child labor and need to be eliminated as a matter of urgency, irrespective of the country's level of development. So this convention also talks about, much as it's an ILO convention on worst forms of child labor, it does classify trafficking as one form of forced labor, or what is called modern slavery. Next. The trafficking in children usually happens both internally and across borders, and even across continents, as we've seen in the recent past. And it is closely linked with the demand for cheap labor. And in most sectors and employers, where working conditions and treatment grossly violates the human rights of children. If you've heard about what happens in South Asia, where most children are working in closed factories and they will not be treated well. Obviously, the children that, weave carpets, those who make, who are in factories that make footballs in Pakistan. We've known of so many cases and examples. But here in Africa and across our continent, we are not any different. I think many children actually end up in sectors where, even on agricultural farms, they are mistreated and they have been trafficked. I know for a fact that in Kenya here, we have so many children that have been trafficked from our neighboring countries, from Uganda, from Tanzania. They end up working in the coffee sector, on tea plantations, and even in homes. Many actually are in homes doing domestic work, which is a worst form of child labor as well, because these children are not supposed to be working in people's homes. It's illegal. They are supposed to be in school. Next. And then many of these environments are characterized by really dangerous conditions that affect the health and development of children. And therefore, in the ILO language, these are classified as hazardous worst forms of child labor. So we have child labor as a worst form, where children actually, their health and psychological the psychology is affected, they are deprived of education, they live in very, very hazardous conditions, and therefore this is also defined as hazardous forms of work. For example, where children end up working in mines, they are trafficked and they end up being helpers on mining sites. I think I have seen cases in Tanzania when I worked there, in some of the places where they mine gold, the artisanal mining companies. You find children actually are being used to separate the gold nuggets with the very dangerous chemicals and with no protection. And then they end up actually dying in the holes, because these are artisanal miners who are doing it in a manual way. And they leave so many deep holes in the community, and so many children have lost their lives as a result. Next. So the forms that we are talking about range from a number of forms of hazardous, what we term as hazardous work. As I mentioned earlier, there's the whole area of domestic work. And you may wonder, how does this become hazardous? Because a child is in a home. But most times, these children work for long hours. They are the last to go to sleep. They will not eat. And a lot of the times, they are also sexually abused and other forms of abuse. For example, we've known children who are beaten so badly, some are burnt, some, there's a lot that happens in the homes where children are trafficked and they end up in child domestic labor. Then the other form is bonded labor. Sorry, can you go back to that? Bonded labor. I think this happens a lot in Asian countries, but I'm sure it is also happening in Africa, where a child is sent to work in form of paying a debt. Let's say a family owes somebody money and they send in their child to work until that debt is paid. It may not be happening a lot, but I'm sure it does happen. Then, of course, commercial sex exploitation. Camel joking happens a lot as well in North Africa, where they keep camels. Then commercial sex exploitation and prostitution, which we know very much even in our cities here in Kenya and East Africa region. Drug curing. When I worked in South Africa, there was a lot of that. Children were used to transport drugs. And then, of course, children who are recruited as young soldiers in the army. And all these practices expose the children to hazardous natures of work. I mean, you can imagine an underage child carrying a gun and at the war front. Next. I also wanted to discuss or to let you know about other instruments within that are international, but also some that are conventions of the ILO that describe what nations are supposed to do in order to take measures against all forms of trafficking in women and exploitation of children. The Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Child Labor, rather, of all forms of discrimination against women, CEDAW of 1979. I think most of our countries are signatories to this convention. And in particular, Article 6 states that parties shall take all appropriate measures, including legislation, to suppress all forms of trafficking in women and exploitation of prostitution of women. And here we may be talking about adult women, but we also know that there are young women who would be categorized as children who end up being trafficked for prostitution. Next. The Convention on the Rights of the Child, 1990, specifies, particularly in Article 34, that children should be protected from all forms of sexual exploitation and sexual abuse, and that nations should take appropriate measures, such as to make sure that children don't engage in any unlawful sexual activity, the use of children in prostitution or other unlawful sexual practices, use of children in pornographic performances and materials. And Article 35 also speaks about measures to prevent the abduction of and sale of or trafficking of children for any purpose or in any form. So again, we have the Convention on the Rights of the Child as a guiding international legal instrument that speaks about abuse of children. Next. So the ILO Convention on the Worst Forms of Child Labor and the optional protocol on the Convention on the Rights of the Child on the sale of children, child protection, child prostitution, and child pornography, as well as the ILO 2014 protocol, all are supportive international instruments that nations have ratified and signed to that provide measures of how children can be protected. Next. In the trafficking protocol, I wanted to specifically speak about Article 2 that talks about trafficking. The trafficking protocol offers a framework for tackling the problem of human trafficking, and specifically to prevent and combat trafficking in persons, paying particular attention to women and children, to protect and assist victims of such trafficking with full respect for their human rights, and thirdly, to promote international cooperation to achieve the above objectives. So that's a protocol that we need to be aware of because of the provisions for protecting children, but also preventing trafficking happening in the first place, as well as making sure that those who fall victims of trafficking have full respect and their human rights are protected. Next. Then the provisions of this trafficking protocol also specifically point to criminalization, which is in Article 5, assistance and protection of victims in Article 6, temporary residence and repatriation in Articles 7 to 8. Then the prevention article is 9, and then information exchange and training, Article 10, 11 to 13, which specifically focus on border measures and documentation. Next. I just wanted to quickly go through the pull and push factors that get children into trafficking. One is that there's large supply of potential victims. Recently in the news, there was a man who was arrested in Uganda who had been trafficking children for about 20 years. And on this particular incident, he was recorded on video talking to a British journalist from BBC who had been tipped off about him. And he was talking about many thousands of children that had been trafficked for all those many years. And this guy was actually, living at large. And so when we talk about the large supply of potential victims, that explains how there are many children in communities that are actually available to traffickers. And the reason is because of the economic difficulties, lack of employment opportunities, poverty, literacy, and lack of awareness. Many of the families whose children end up being trafficked are actually not aware that there is anything called trafficking. They innocently give away their children under the guise of people who are going to take them to school and help them, just simply because the communities are so poor and they are so trusting. The other push factor is the growing demand for women and children for sex trafficking, forced and exploitative labor. Like I had mentioned earlier, there is a growing demand because children by their nature are very innocent. They don't demand a lot and they are cheap as well as women. And so there's a whole new dimension about sex trafficking that maybe we are not really focusing on, but we know that is happening. And it does not necessarily have to be across the borders, but also within the countries. There is a lot that is happening that most of these traffickers and perpetrators go scot-free. Then, of course, the organized criminal networks that exploits the supply and demand situation. And there's a very high profit margin. And in many cases, because they're dealing with very innocent human beings, there's also low risk in crime because these children are actually silenced into never talking about who the traffickers are next. And I'm about to finish. I just wanted also to bring out the gender and human rights perspective to trafficking. The concept of human rights-based approach to development has gained importance and offers a good framework which we could all adopt in terms of the relevance of the standards and standard setting. So the rights-based approach naturally includes elimination of all forms of discrimination. And in this case, we approach protection and prevention of trafficking in children from a rights perspective, that every child has a right to be protected, to live a full life where children live as children, they grow and, be children and they're in school as well as women. Next. So women migrant workers, whether documented or undocumented, as well as children, are much more vulnerable to discrimination and exploitation and abuse. And I bring in the angle of women because normally, in most cases, women who are migrant workers would go with children. And that's, for me, I think we focus on the adults, but the children are equally vulnerable. So women and girls are also at risk. And it seems to me that they will be more at risk than boys and girls. And we've seen it, especially here in Kenya, where we've seen so many cases of young women who have been trafficked to the Middle East, and they end up really being tortured badly. And some will go actually documented, and they are formally recruited by employment agencies. But the story, when they get there and how they end up, is always different. Next. So I also wanted to bring in the aspect of labor inspection, because we're talking about ILO, and the work we do also involves working with the government labor inspection department, whose aim is to supervise and make sure there's compliance with the legal provisions of protection of workers generally. It's also part of the administration of labor to make sure that they combat all forms of discrimination at the workplace, including sexual and other harassment, as well as human trafficking, forced labor, and child labor. And their service should play an important role in preventing and eliminating discriminatory practices in the workplace, but also to be the channel through which education and awareness is transmitted to workers in the workplace, who in turn take it to their families and communities. Next. So just in a nutshell, I wanted to show where a child and all that happens around them, especially in trafficking as an organized crime. You can see that there are so many people who are involved in the network to get this child into where they find themselves. And we need to pay attention to all the network if we are to crack it and end it. Next. I just also wanted to talk a bit about the facts and figures that we have according to the recent, not very recent, UNODC report on trafficking in person of 2016. There's no country that is immune to this crime, and I'm sure I heard Kenya and all the colleagues on the panel know. This report highlighted that countries have reported increased numbers of detected trafficking victims over the years, and this has resulted in an enhanced national capacity to detect, record, and report data on trafficking, and the growth in incidents of trafficking. I want to believe that we may have even better data that is most current. Next. We can skip that and then maybe go to, no, sorry, could you go back and then I finalize? Just to say that the nature of trafficking is changing over the years, and men and children are increasing in number. And this has also been reported that where most victims are detected, you'll find either an adult woman, which is the highest number, obviously, but then children are also increasing. And this same report, it specifies that it's really a concern. And we need to also be concerned as people who work in this area, that children are getting the numbers are increasing globally, but also in Africa. And we need to really take a holistic approach that involves everybody, that throughout the educational system, the communities, that they are aware and they stop being so trusting, because a lot of the times children really end where they are because their parents, guardians, and people in their communities are part of the process. Okay, I want to stop here and thank you so much. I'm sorry that I took a bit long, but I thought I would share this. Over to you, Winnie.
Thank you very much, Grace. Yes, it has taken a little bit longer than we had expected. However, I think it gives us a great overview on what is available, what really anchors our discussions. Why do we term some things a crime now when they're not a crime 10, 20 years ago? So I think it helps us to be able to understand why are we having this discussion in the first place. So thank you very much for taking us through that discussion. And I think maybe just to be able to break it down further, I'd like us to reflect a bit. We had a whole year of 2020 where we had children stuck in our homes. And they were not able to access education. They were forced to stay in their homes. And we had a rise when it comes to trafficking cases, looking at sex trafficking and all. And then the question would be, we have all these policies in place. You've mentioned quite a number of protocols and conventions, and we have been able to domesticate these as well in Kenya, where we have the Children's Act, we have the Sexual Offences Act, we have the Trafficking in Persons Act. We have all these policies in place, but we still see these crimes still thriving. So then the question becomes, what's the gap? What's missing? What is lacking with regards? Is it the communication? Is it the policies? What's the gap? And I think for us to be able to respond to this, I'd want to start with Michelle, and then I'd like to hear the same from Mr. Gita. We have the policies. Our government is here. What's the gap? Michelle, over to you. Michelle, you're on mute.
My apologies. I want to thank Madam Grace for that very wonderful presentation, to Heart Kenya and to all the partners here today. Yes, you ask a very good question. One of the issues that I wanted to raise was a critical gap in relation to a somewhat often not discussed enough crime and form of trafficking, which is orphanage trafficking. So what am I speaking when I talk about this? I'm talking about the recruitment of children into orphanages. So in Kenya, we call them CCIs, charitable children's institutions. And this is for the purpose of exploitation, particularly for profit, and sometimes also with the involvement of what is known as orphanage volunteerism. This is not to suggest that every single CCI or orphanage, of course, is engaged in trafficking. These terms are certainly not synonymous. But what we're seeing here overall is a fundamental problem of so many actors. Just as Madam Grace talked about, I'm reflecting a little bit on the last graphic on who are we looking at as part of this package, who is being involved in this recruitment of children, this inappropriate use of institutional care, which actually really harms the rights and welfare of children. And how do we really achieve this? I think in Kenya, the government of Kenya has been making significant progress over the last years to change reform systems. So this includes decreasing reliance on institutionalization, a process we call deinstitutionalization, increasing alternatives, and as also to hark back to Madam Grace, is the push factors we see for orphanage trafficking is that very promise of education, is that very trusting family member who will often place a child in residential care because they simply don't have access to those services. So now when we look at the gaps here, we have to ask ourselves who are involved in this system. This really talks about broader reforms that we need to make, including divestment strategies away from residential care institutions. It's not only foreigners, we often talk about it in this context, but we do have to recognize the role that international donors, volunteers play as well in this problem in Kenya, which actually effectively sees the recruitment of children for for the purpose of exploitation, and often inappropriately placed for inappropriate long times. We see a clear link. We see it in Kenya, we see it in other countries, in East Africa, in other regions across the world. But what must be made clear is that the recruitment of a child to an institution for the purpose of exploitation is indeed trafficking and slavery. Many of these children have one or both living parents, and we know very well that institutionalization increases a child's risk sort of to all various forms of exploitation, including other forms of trafficking. We also know that institutionalization is often used as a response. So I think when we think about the gaps, we have to, just as Madam Grace alluded to, we have to look at this as the broader system, strengthening the family so they are able to care for the child in the first place, working with donors, working with others to really ensure the policies are in place in Kenya. The government of Kenya is doing a wonderful job in care reforms, which we understand is a process, but to understand that now, how does this form of trafficking play out here? This is something we also need to prevent. And we need to make sure that when COVID-19 has, we all hope, of course, as subsides and travel picks up and tourism picks up, that we are not going to see an influx of individuals caring for what we call COVID, what could be termed COVID orphans, whether that's true or not, because we know most children in Kenya
Oh, Michelle, we are losing you.
also working in the alternative, in the human trafficking space, and to find those solutions also for victims, but also ahead of time. I know I could probably go on about this forever. I'll stop there. I'm not sure if I answered your question, Winnie, in the long of it.
Yes, Michelle. I think you get to remind us again that trafficking is an organized crime. And these are criminals where they're using our existing structures, use them to actually create their own space where they still get to exploit children. I think that's a good reminder for us to remember. It's not always the case where we're looking at a child being taken from their family and being made to work as a domestic help. How else is actually trafficking manifesting itself when we are looking at child trafficking? I think that's a good reminder for us to remember. It's evolving, and we have traffickers going way ahead and trying to see how they can outsmart the law, how they can outsmart the systems. So that also reminds us that we also need to also be smarter and be able to actually arrest them and be able to deter this from happening. I think just to follow up on what you've been able to share, looking at also the angle where Mr. Gitau is doing the investigations. We have the policies that guide, where we have more or less a clear system. We have a well-devolved system looking at support to children. We have the children department, and we have the policies in place, we have the guidelines. But again, we still see very many children ending up being victims of human trafficking, even looking at child labor, sex trafficking, those are forced into begging. And we've had Grace being able to outline in detail, even looking at child marriage and all. So what is missing? Because we have these available. What is missing, looking at your perspective, Mr. Gitau, as someone who gets to investigate and work with the communities in this area?
Thank you, Winnie. Once again, I welcome this opportunity to contribute to this discussion. And from a law enforcement perspective of what we encounter on a daily basis, very good points have been made by the previous contributors, and I appreciate the role that's being made by the civil society organizations, non-government organizations. But there's a lot of challenges in terms of victim support. For instance, where we come across children who've been rescued from trafficking rings. It's a big challenge that we go through, and this can be given. We can give an example of the Karamajong girls who come from Uganda, and whom we've been trying to work around to try and solve the issue. And for this, we've had a challenge of getting facilities where to place them before we do repatriation, for instance. Then The other big problem is the long time that cases are taken, that cases take to adjudicate. And for instance, when you have these victims, we have a limit in terms of how long they can stay in a facility, how long they can be supported in those facilities, what kind of care should be given unto them. So at the end of the day, we find that most of the victims now even get tired of staying in these facilities and want to leave those facilities and continue with their normal lives. The other challenges that we've encountered with especially child trafficking, which is our main focus for our investigations, is having specialized counselors within the country, and also specialized facilities for those rescued children. The previous presenter has talked about the institutionalization, which is a good thing, but we still need facilities to place victims once we come across them, because we are facing a challenge as you walk down the streets of Nairobi, which is a good example I like to give on how much we are doing as stakeholders in terms of solving the issue of child trafficking. You'll find so many disabled kids on the streets, and these kids are not there by choice. They're being trafficked, and every other day, any roundabout in this Nairobi, you'll find most of them there. But it's not that nothing can be done about it, but nobody wants to accept those children with specialized needs and keep them in their facilities, for instance. It calls for more. Also, there are so many cases that go unreported, which is why we've also come up with a hotline, which is the main hotline for the DCI. We've received a lot of cases through the hotline. For now, that means that the publicity on the hotline has gone to the most local level, because we're getting cases from as far as Meru, from members of the public in far-flung areas in the country, which increases our opportunity to intervene before a lot of harm has been done to victims of child trafficking. But also, of course, there's a discussion on the review of the act to address gaps in the legislation. We've had missed opportunities to put people behind bars because maybe we can say there's lack of understanding about the act, which has been in place for a long time, and investigations are done well and everything is collected, all evidence has been collected. But at the end of the day, you find that the prescribed sentence or fines are too low to deter the criminals from actually repeating the offenses. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gitau. I think with your response, you highlight quite a number of challenges, and in the same, you get to give us some solutions where we're looking at where we are not having enough cases being reported. Now we have a hotline. Where we're looking at gaps in policy, we are seeing a review of the same. So I think this helps us, and I think there's some areas we still don't have answers to. Looking at delayed justice because of having long time, having a lot of time taking place when we still have cases in court. And maybe we need to bring someone from the judiciary to be able to actually give us some answers to this. What can actually be done to respond to this? But we bring forth a very interesting discussion looking at what is happening within the region, where in Kenya, we are now looking at how do we support children who are being trafficked from Uganda. And we've had a similar experience looking at children trafficked from Burundi, from Ethiopia, Eritrea, and the like, who we have to look at now what needs to get done when we have traffickers now getting children from across the region, and heart becomes, not heart rather, Kenya becomes the hub where we have now exploitation. So maybe not to look back to what Grace was sharing, and I'm not sure if Grace is still on the call. Yes, Grace is still on the call. What Grace was sharing, looking at the policies that we have and what is being done. So maybe looking at the region, Grace, what is lacking? looking at East Africa, if we can maybe narrow it down to that, what is lacking? What are the gaps? Looking at how we are operating as states, what more needs to get done?
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Winnie, and thank you, Michelle and Mr. Gitau, for your discussion. I think I like the gaps that were raised by Mr. Gitau. He really brings out very interesting areas about what they're experiencing in the process of prosecution and investigation. Just to answer your question, there's quite a lot that is actually lacking. Otherwise, there should be no reason why the numbers of children trafficked should increase. I think generally speaking, I would say the whole understanding of the issue is so critical. We assume that around those of us around this call, because we have been made aware, we understand the issue. But for me, I think there's generally still lack of understanding. Glad to hear from Mr. Gitau that because of the hotline, there are many cases that are being reported. But I can assure you, in the region, there are so many that still remain unreported. And for me, I think the most cost-effective way to fight child trafficking is to stop it before it happens. And this requires a clear understanding of the problem and the root causes, and finding ways to minimize the risk factors. Because there are several risk factors. If you remember, I don't know, most of you maybe are younger, but I grew up at a time when all of us in the community belonged to the village, all children. I mean, you'd meet a child who seems to be lost, and you quickly rescue that child. Ask where they're coming from, make sure you take them where they're coming, where their home is. But now children are all over and nobody cares. Communities have become so individualistic that even a crime can happen just next door when you know it and you keep quiet. Then secondly, I think there's a lack of learning from former victims. We know that there are so many children that have been rescued. And if we're able to learn from their experiences, then it will help the risk factors and then how the interplay. And I think most of all, we need to target children that are most vulnerable. They are known. There are families that are so poor that where children just run away from home because they're looking for food. There are children who are in a very abusive environments. Those are known. There are orphan children who are left on their own. So the categories of children who are vulnerable are known, but we tend to look elsewhere and sort of leave these alone, and yet they're the ones that end up in trafficking situations. Then I think I also wanted to bring in the aspect of child participation, which is very critical. That children we need to stop talking as adults to ourselves and bring in children so that they really get to know what they are up against. When I worked for UNICEF, I know we had a very, effective program that we're doing with schools, teaching or building life skills. And it still goes on actually, because it was a very robust program that helped a lot of young girls, especially to prevent early marriages, abuse. So they know what to say when they're in situations, but also they talk to each other. So in most schools in Uganda, they have formed child rights clubs in schools where they talk about these things and are able to prevent them before they happen, because the children are skilled and they know when to say no to a stranger, when to say no to somebody who is showing signs of abuse. And in that form, then they talk to each other, and there's a support mechanism around the school. The girls from Karamoja that you're talking about, I want to believe most of those are even out of school. They either have not gone to school or dropped out, and they are so vulnerable. You know, they are taken across the border. And it's very, very sad because I've heard of this story for a while, and it seems to me that these girls are still actually not being, they have not been taken back home. So Mr. Gitao, maybe you could give us more information and we see how to follow up, because as a Ugandan, I'm very concerned actually. Then lastly, I think there's also in communities, communities can be resource people and be empowered. You know, I don't know how we can do that. Heart Kenya, maybe we could hear what role you can play to understand what creates vulnerability. I mean, we know it's about poverty, it's about all the things we talked about, but we can actually build communities' capacity to understand the issue and deal with it, especially to understand that it's a criminal offense, even as a parent, to push your child into trafficking. You know, there's nowhere they say ignorance of the law is no, you know, you can't fall back on the fact that you are ignorant. It's not a defense. But at the same time, we know our communities actually are very ignorant. But lastly, and as why I end, is to say that within the East Africa region, there are efforts to have, for example, there's the police mechanism where the police in the countries in the East Africa region have a common understanding of how to work together, but mainly they are looking at hardcore criminal things. But I think also if we could integrate child trafficking, I'm sure they also deal with that, because crimes that are cross-border really require nations to work together. And I think one thing I know, for example, the East African community, the Secretariat, they have a whole section that is focused on trafficking, and they try to align the protocols and national legal instruments so that they speak to each other. I don't know how effective they are, because the Legislative Assembly, where members of parliament come from the different East African countries, they formulate policies that are at that level, but they cannot force countries to domesticate them, because countries have their liberty to have their national laws. But in as much as possible, the membership of the Legislative Council of East Africa tries to influence the national parliaments to understand the gravity of some of these things and try to align the policies. Thank you, Winnie.
Thank you very much, Grace. A very elaborate answer that responds to many things and even gets to, I think it gets to respond even to my next question, where we're looking at we're looking at the voice of the child. Where does it actually lie in the whole discussion? And even looking at you mentioning prevention aspects, because so far what has been mentioned, looking at Mr. Gitao, is at the tail end of the whole process, where once one has been trafficked, they're able not to get the reports and be able to try and see how that person can be able to get support. With what Michelle was sharing with orphanage trafficking, we are looking at when that crime has already happened. But now the question is, how do we prevent this from happening? Because the policies try to guide on both ends, where what can be done to prevent, and then when this happens, then how do we have proper child protection and proper child support being offered to victims of these crimes. And so maybe my question would be, and I think I'll come back to you, Grace, as well as Mr. Gitao. Maybe just a question for you, Rachel, as an advocate. What has been your experience? How do children get to experience justice, looking at them being in the corridors of justice? How does this look like for them?
Thank you so much for the question. And thank you, panelists, for all the views that and opinions you've given. So for the child, in terms of the law, they are either in conflict of the law or in contact with the law. At that point in time, in cases of child trafficking, especially in cases relating to children who have come from other countries and they have come into our country, in terms of refugees, sometimes they can be seen as unaccompanied minors or separated minors. And as such, they are not able to carry their documentation with them to verify who they are, their ages, and where they are going. So they are much more vulnerable to trafficking at that point in time, and much more vulnerable to the traffickers being able to exploit them in various forms, as the way Miss Grace Banya had articulated very well. So in these times, or in that period of time, probably they're put in shelters or safe homes so that they can await, they can go through the legal process, the age assessments, the medical assessments, the mental assessments, just to show whether they understand what has happened, and also to show how they can be able to give information of how the trafficker, of how they came towards being exploited, or where they were going, and their engagement with the trafficker as well. So in that point in time, being put in the homes or in the shelters, maybe at that point in time, they are not able to properly understand the situation. And at that point in time, also due to their ages, because sometimes it differs, they can be brought from 6 years or 10 years to 17 years, depending on what it has happened to them. Some of them may be looking for work, but in terms of looking for work, they may find themselves in domestic servitude situations, prostitution, or sexual exploitation. So at that point in time in the homes, you might find them having to relieve the traumas maybe they had undergone in their journeys, the traumas, and that can be a psychological problem that can affect their mental capacities. So as I agree with other panelists, sometimes due to the lack of limited resources, in where to keep them and for how much time they're supposed to be there, it can be a challenge on how the assistance can be given. And also in terms of giving proper intervention strategies meaning that putting all, if the children have been taken from the host communities, maybe empowering the families, the community, just to take up that ownership, as the way Grace Banya had articulated, protecting them, taking them through that process of how they can be healing, not only for the child, but also for the family as well, so that they can also understand the rights of the child. They can also understand that this is a violation, yeah? Because some of the families, as we have heard here, act out of desperation and poverty. There is no other way to provide. And sometimes you might find these households as well, they are child-headed households, meaning there is no father or mother, and the child is the head of the family, providing for the other children. So he or she misses out on the growth and development that she would need to succeed in life, or to make him or her an upstanding citizen, or to gain the experience. So economically empowering them on how they can be able to achieve the skills, supporting them, also collaborating with the government, with CSOs, and seeing how we can be able to mitigate these issues in regards to how they can get assistance. And as well as you well said, Winnie, the judiciary is good if they can tell us a solution of why access to justice and the delay process has contributed also to psychological trauma. Because you can imagine, if this child has relieved that trauma throughout being trafficked, if it was because we all know that the child does not have a consent to be trafficked. So relieving that trauma day in, day out, sometimes it can erode the evidence. Sometimes information can get lost. And then remember, defense hearings, prosecution hearings can take a long time. So some information that even when a person is being cross-examined in court, they can, even when a child is being cross-examined in court, the information won't be really tallied. There'll be erosion of how the trafficking had been conducted. And as well as Mr. Gitau had said, some of these penalties being given are very less. That is as a result, because you can find the information or the testimonies or the witness testimonies being given, they don't tally. So there is just a smidge, there is a reasonable doubt existing, because that is the extent of criminal proceedings, because it's a criminal act. So it relies on reasonable evidence, reasonable doubt, and as you can see, the erosion can contribute to how the outcome of the case can be. So you can find, so now you find the cases have finished, the child has been taken to the host family, but now you'll just find them just going back back to trafficking, because now there is no other way to provide, or there is no other way to protect themselves in terms of the family, in terms of the legal justice system, in terms of the interpretation, as Mr. Gitau had properly said, of the laws, as well as how we can be able to protect them. So that is my contribution. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachel. I think this is the challenge when you have a panel that is very rich with information and experience. Everyone tries, every time they speak, then you have new issues being brought up. But maybe just with due respect to the time that we have, maybe to be able to follow up with Mr. Gitau, with whatever has been shared so far. Maybe first it would be a question, Mr. Gitau, to you. Do you think criminal justice system is child friendly? And if yes or no, what can be done? Depending, if it's yes, it's great, then we are good. And if it's no, then what we need to consider, and what support can be offered for this to be more friendly to children?
Thank you very much, Winnie. Yes, I would say yes, the criminal justice in Kenya is child friendly. And as of now, issues pertaining matters to deal with children are prioritized. We have a timeline of 6 months to expedite any cases that touch on children. I think also when it comes to issues of testimony in courts, there's a lot of protections given to victims, especially child victims in court. And the same, we employ a strategy of interviewing kids that is very child friendly in our unit, for instance, and something that's also been replicated in most police stations in Kenya to try and build a rapport with children who are our clients in that particular instance when they come to make those reports or whenever we are conducting investigations. So yes, but more and more still needs to be done. And going forward, I think the future is bright for our children in terms of their access to justice in the criminal justice system in Kenya.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gitau. Maybe an additional question with regards to reporting of these cases. As someone who does investigations, what would you request the public to do more to really be able to support what you are trying to achieve?
I think we need to spread the gospel. As they say, we need to spread the gospel, especially on the crimes that are affecting children, for instance, and a lot, especially on child trafficking, that there's need and a lot of needs to do a lot of awareness in communities, which is way more effective because this is where the crimes are happening. It's easier to have it, to have communities making these reports, and that gives us an opportunity to intervene before a lot of exploitation or even before the exploitation has actually happened. So we, as a unit, we've conducted a number of forums especially during this period when we have the COVID-19 pandemic. We have adopted a strategy to speak in schools, where to speak on the dangers of being online, because we also therefore there's a lot of recruitment online, partnering with NGOs that are doing awareness creation, which will go away. We will do a lot of justice to help us in curbing the high number of cases that we have in. And we've seen a lot of response from community leaders, religious leaders, who've actually appreciated the crime of child trafficking. And now we receive more reports from these communities, especially in slums within Nairobi, on any cases that touch on child abuse and sexual exploitation. So a lot of more awareness creation should be done, which is going to help a long way in dealing with the issue of child trafficking and any other forms of offending against children. And I would give an instance with the case of Gregory Doe. This is a case in Bomet, which was highlighted in the media. And we can say we might call it ignorance, but also we also have to appreciate our societies and how they work, and how different communities work, and what's the push factors that are pushing kids to such institutions, or why the unemployment, the poverty levels in our communities. So with awareness, this would help a lot in helping the parents make informed decisions on such issues when they're approached with such offers. And they would also have redress, where to seek redress in case they are facing such challenges, or they are facing such offenses being committed within their communities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gitau. And I think you bring in one thing that we always need to be reminded of, that just because we define something as a crime doesn't mean that the community gets to understand it that way. So also us being able to align and have the same understanding with what we regard to as abuse, what we regard to as a crime. If it's not appreciated the same way by the community, then again, we won't get the same outcome that we are looking out for. But yes, agreeing, a lot of awareness required for us to be able to prevent one. And those who get into the arms of traffickers, then they are able to get the much needed support. Thank you very much for that. So maybe jumping back to Michelle, we've had a mention of the role of the community, the role of the family, what the government is doing, what we have the CCI is doing. But then the question is, with all these individuals involved, what should be the understanding on what is child protection and safeguard? What should this look like? With us also understanding that sometimes you're creating spaces for this, but then it ends up being a space where the children are being exploited, like what we've been able to talk about orphanage trafficking. So what is child protection and safeguarding? What does this mean? If you're able to break it down for someone who is hosting a child, someone to be able to understand, am I actually doing the right thing, or am I actually committing a crime at this stage?
Hi, sorry, Winnie. I unfortunately got kicked out there, so I didn't hear the question. My apologies, sincerely.
No problem. I'll repeat it for you again. The question is around, we've had a mention of looking at the grassroots, what are the push factors? And we're looking at the different stakeholders involved in this. We have the families, we're looking at households where we don't even have guardians or parents with the children, and looking at what the community is doing, and we have what the government is doing, and what some of the CSOs are doing, and looking at CCI is also being put in place, with the goal and the aim of having protection for children. But then we've realized that this is not always the case, where just because we have an individual offering to take care, they don't always offer protection that is actually required. So just being able to elaborate further on what is child protection and safeguarding in a way that as communities we're able to understand when this happens, what is the difference when we're able to tell this is not okay and this can be allowed and this is okay? What is child protection and safeguarding? Maybe in the simplest way possible.
Yeah, I love what everybody's bringing out here and the importance of communities actually in getting involved, because that's really where this is going to happen. Traditionally, children were cared and protected for by communities. And how do we bring ourselves back to using these traditional awareness? We also have wonderful learning. We have wonderful learning from also other countries in the region and also within our country, within Kenya, on how do we effectively sensitize so that everybody understands their roles and responsibilities. So I'm talking from the whole Nagao structure, down from the AACs, the area advisory councils, to the chiefs, to the police. How do we better come together, to the Nyumba Kumi, to the elders, to the religious leaders, and sharing those key and critical messages of the importance of keeping children and families. But I appreciate very much what Mr. Gitau and Rachel and Madam Grace and others, we really have to go always hark back to this notion of the vulnerabilities which exist in our communities that precede recruitment. What are these? These are poverty. These are child protection systems, which may not be, they may be in place, but not quite be as strong as they could be. So I think it's incumbent, and I think DCS and other partners are working as part and parcel with care reforms, and to think, how can we package this all together? How can we stop looking at child protection and alternative care as a separate issue? How can we stop looking at social protection as a separate issue? And how can we bring all these issues together as an interface? And how do we find sort of a space to have concerted action to expand, to understand those referral pathways? Do we really know in every community where somebody can go? Now, if you ask a chief and you do a good job, it's amazing what you can find. And that's what we've learned in this process. They'll often say, oh, well, so-and-so is an informal group of such and such, that they do building of, they help with irrigation of the Shamba, or they do such and such. So how can we identify those key resources that, first of all, already exist? We're always so quick to go abroad. How our communities are indeed stronger than I think a lot of the times we give them credit for. And how do we give that critical information? Of course, there still needs to be a bigger strengthening of social protection. We have to have a concerted effort here to expand those very protection systems to families already. How do we increase cash transfers? How do we increase the availability of access to school? We know primary school is free, but is it really free? How do we address these when we break them down to these small components, we realize we're all talking here about the same thing. What we're talking is about strengthening our fundamental core of society. How do we go back to traditional roots? The Constitution of Kenya is very clear. The family is the fundamental unit of society. This is the same reflection in the African Charter. This is the same in the UNCRC, the Alternative Care Guidelines, Kenyan law. Now, how do we come to a place then where we actually work hand in hand with communities to understand that it is our responsibility? I think it's about, as Madam Rachel, Madam Grace, Mr. Gitau, having them lead these discussions. We're sitting here today. Maybe actually next time we invite a group of chiefs. Maybe next time we have this discussion, how do we think? How do we understand abuse? How can we work together to understand what is right and wrong? So orphanages, and my apologies, I have a small dog who is barking in the background, who I'm trying to hold. But when we look at really what is actually happening here if you think about orphanage trafficking in particular, it's this feeling that, well, that child is cared and protected for. We need to redefine this space. We know that children are absolutely harmed in institutional care. We understand very well, as others have mentioned, that the alternatives are incredibly underfunded. They're not there yet. But how can we, as alternative care sectors, trafficking, DCI, DCS, NCCS, we can go on and name the actors that need to be involved. Kenya Border, the Kenya Border Services, how can they be involved to outroot tourism. We need to have this discussion together, but we need to come to this fundamental place where communities are taking a stand. And I think if we look, we do have excellent examples. And I think as Madam Grace, if I may, I think she said earlier, we need to learn from these partners, CSOs need to document these. Tell us what worked for you and your communities, and how can we bring local actors together in a more localized solution that's really cross-cutting, that we're really hitting all this. I could probably go on forever because I'm quite, yeah, I think that if we really come together and strengthen with community, find those resources also within, and be deliberate and intentional. We be really deliberate, intentional about how we deliver this. Orphanage trafficking is not an issue of only the foreigner coming in. We know Kenyans, for example, Christmas, Sundays. How many of us on this call have dropped unga before? Have dropped some maize? We've dropped something. We've dropped some high flyers. I mean, we have to ask ourselves these questions. And us in the trafficking space, yes, we need specialized services. We need specialized services for victims. They need proper counseling, proper legal support. That's why I'm so happy to see Rachel here. Victims need proper legal support. I'm happy to see Mr. Gitau doing excellent work also in this front. But how do we come now? And I think this is a good starting point to bring this conversation into alternatives. They may not exist now, but we know that there's so much more to be done. And I think that this really starts at that family strengthening and preservation, and asking ourselves, as we try to defeat and prevent this crime, how are we going to respond to this in a way that is actually supportive in a family-based environment? And I think our framework gives us many answers to that. And it's about now partners coming together. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. I think no need to add anything to that. Very, very elaborate. And it takes us back to the beginning, where we're looking at who is needed here. Why do we need to have this conversation? And also redefining what is prevention. Is it just talking to people and telling them, hey, is trafficking, don't do ABCD? Or is it actually looking at how do we support the communities better for them to actually be able to create resilience against traffickers, you know? So even looking at when we say protection, how do we live that on our day-to-day? Is it just a thing of, oh, someone now has suffered, someone has been abused, what do we do? Or is it how we manage and protect children on a daily basis? And looking also at the prosecution angle, criminal justice system. What needs to happen when now someone has been violated? Then what's the next, you know? And looking at mentioning the different stakeholders involved. I think if they would take us through the whole 4 Ps to respond to the question, where we all are needed to work together for this to actually be addressed. It's a step-by-step process, but we have to begin somewhere, and we all have to be able to agree on where do we begin from, and then how do we proceed? Because if we define it differently, then we'll be working towards the same direction, but now heading towards different routes. So I think your response really gets to expound deeper on why we're even having this discussion. And so maybe for me not to lock out the audience, I can see we have some questions, and then we can be able to wrap this up today. I'll jump straight into the comments where we have some feedback. There's one question: in what ways can we delink the cultural practices, such as living with relatives for support from child trafficking, especially where such children are exploited? I think we were able to speak about this a little while back with Madam Grace, but anyone wants to add to this with regards to the question on cultural practices? We have heavily looking at child marriages and looking also back at some of the ways we've been able to live, where we have relatives staying with our children, then they end up being exploited. Anyone who wants to add to this?
Maybe when I can come in on that. I think Rachel and I had provided answers directly on the chat, but I can add something. Thank you so much, Michelle, first of all, for that elaborate response to the question. I wanted to just, in addition to what Rachel and I posted on the chat, I wanted to reiterate that information is a powerful tool, and it should be provided to children and their parents and guardians. because, you know, without being informed, that we'll keep the communities, however much we want them to be on board and deal with this issue. There's still a strong, you know, focus on culture and tradition. And I have met it a lot when we talk about child labor, and you see people's eyes swing from one side to the other, and they're like, really? Are you telling us not to let children work? Because culturally and socially, children are expected to be doing things in the home. But then where do you cut off the point when it becomes exploitative and when it is socializing, teaching a child what to do? So in the same way, we need to really educate communities about child trafficking so they get the real information and they understand, both children and their families, because there's not enough to just say we are creating awareness. They need to really understand, because it took so long for communities around our countries in the East Africa region to appreciate child rights. Because initially it was like, oh no, this is a foreign idea. You're bringing things that, you know, are going to make our children rebels. But over the years, the communities themselves stand up for their children's rights because they understand. So we need to do a little more, actually very much, especially on behavior change, for parents and guardians who think, no way, I mean, this child is mine and I have a right to send them where I want. And so over they shoot them off and export them to Nairobi and the towns to go and work. And, you know, at the end of the day, whatever else happens, it's as if they are not part of it. So I think we need to really provide clear information explaining clearly what trafficking is in visible terms, using whatever materials that can illustrate. I think posters are really a good way. Now with all this social media, I know the communities who are talking about maybe don't even access social media, but we can use the radio, we can use community, you know, role model, you know, things and artists acting out in the community. Those have been very effective in communicating and educating communities about gender violence, gender-based violence, early marriages, and, you know, even issues like female circumcision, you know, where things have worked effectively. Let's learn from that and use the same channels of communicating to communities. Thank you. Thank you, Winnie.
Thank you very much, Grace. Thank you very much, Grace, for that addition. Rachel, I can see your hand is up.
Yes, my hand is up. I just wanted to add something on what Grace has properly articulated. So I also think issues of accountability is important. Accountability in terms of the grassroots levels, in terms of the chiefs, the assistant chiefs, the village elders who are there, the community leaders who are there, the religious leaders, because remember, as to towards harmful cultural practices, child marriages are also a form of defilement, can be a defilement. A person can be charged with the offense of defilement because remember the child does not have consent to be in that situation. So when a family gives over a girl to get married to another person and she is underage, it constitutes harmful care. So in this aspect, I know in the law currently, these grassroots-driven people, the chiefs and the assistant chiefs, have been put to task to be accountable. I remember a time when they were told, especially last year when cases of defilement and SGBV were on the rise due to COVID-19 situation, and people and children were staying at home, they were told that they will also be arrested, even the parent who has been taking this child to get married, or the chief who has accepted this situation, because the chief is the sole, has the sole responsibility to look after his constituents, his people who are there. The parent has the responsibility to give care and control to the child in terms of giving best interests in everything that he or she does. So that accountability aspect is very important, and keeping and putting that accountability into practice will also help in articulating and in mitigating issues on child trafficking, I suppose, as well. And as well as empowering the community, giving information, as Madam Grace has stated, giving ample information continuously, because situations, as we have said, organized crime and our laws are dynamic. Our laws are made to the way our society is progressing. Yeah. So if there is a problem, a law is made or a policy is made so that a solution can come out of it. So with our society being dynamic and continuously changing, the criminal enterprises continuously changing, we should adapt and should be able to keep each other on toes. We should be able to be accountable for our actions, even as parents, as guardians, as people who hold powers in the community, who can be able to make decisions. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachel, reminding us on how, it's not a thing of things happen and no one is questioned or no one is ever held liable. We all have people who are really accountable, and just looking at how do we support the whole process as well. I think a very good reminder for us on that. And so I think as we come to a close, I'd like to ask the panel, looking at our experience as a team, everyone has been in this field for a number of years. And so we are fighting a cause that we've been able to engage in for some time. My question would be, what's the dream? We are seeing reviewing of acts and policies, more conventions coming in, more protocols being brought on board to try and see how better we can address the situation. But what's the dream? Why are we doing this? What do we want to see as the end goal? And maybe as we respond to that, if we can be able to also think around what would be the recommendation generally to the public, and also looking at different stakeholders, what would you recommend for us to be able to do for us to get to that dream that you actually see in this space? And I'd want to request we begin this with Mr. Gitao.
Thank you, Winnie. As a parting shot is that I'll use the commonly used phrase that unity is strength, and the dream is to see the children of this country, the children of the world, protected in the future, because this is the future for the globe. We have to join hands as stakeholders. Each one of us has a role to play. We as law enforcement will do our level best to safeguard and protect kids both online and offline. And we welcome any partnership with any stakeholder and who can contribute in helping in safeguarding our children in this country. Let's join hands and protect the kids and protect all children, regardless of their social status, sex, race, or where they come from. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gitao. Madam Grace?
Thank you so much, Winnie. The dream is about where do we want to go, specifically because this year is the International Year on Elimination of Child Labor. The dream is to stand together with the world and international community to ensure that trafficking has no place in today's 21st century society. It deprives children of their life and their security. and we need to protect them. We need to end child trafficking now. We need to take action. And as far as setting standards and legislation, I think it's important to ensure that whatever we have in place is enforced, that the perpetrators are prosecuted, that in the first place, communities and all of us prevent it from happening, because that's the most cost-effective way to protect our children and give them a good life. And on our part as the ILO and all the other like-minded agencies of the United Nations, we are committed to support Kenya and all its partners to make sure that the policy framework and the legal framework is in place and is enforced, and the capacities of the enforcers are strengthened, but also that the communities and guardians, families, all of us take full responsibility and take action now and end child trafficking. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Grace, calling for action, 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 and Mr. Gitau really calling for partnership. Thank you for that. Michelle?
Thank you. That's quite a hard act to follow. I agree absolutely with Bwana Gitau and Madam Grace. Action, 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 Winnie and members. We need to join hands together. Prevention, prevention, prevention. It is the cheapest, just as Madam Grace has mentioned. Reporting accordingly to DCI, joining forces and hands together, coming together as stakeholders in multiple sectors to not just speak to ourselves in the trafficking space or the investigation space or the alternative care space. How can other spaces come now with us, join hands with us, and have a holistic approach to ensuring that the well-being of children in Kenya is really upheld across all domains: health and well-being, education, early childhood education. We can go on. So prevention, coming together, and being deliberate and intentional, in the messaging, joining hands together. And like our partners on the call today, we stand ready to support the government of Kenya and other partners in their efforts to outroot this menace, which continues to plague our communities. And I think together we are stronger. And I look forward to continued discussions on this matter and finding ways that we can join hands together and ensure that every child in Kenya grows up in a safe, protective, and loving family. And this will help us outroot trafficking, orphanage trafficking, other menaces, and we can start working on those other rights violations as we work together and make sure that our protection systems are fully holistic and meet the needs of children. Thank you so much, Winnie, Heart Kenya, and colleagues for the opportunity today.
Thank you very much, Michelle. And I think just to echo what the three of us have been able to say, Mr. Gitau, Grace, and Michelle, yes, a lot more needs to be done in the different spaces, and definitely we need to be able to add more people into the discussion for us to be able to have a greater impact in what we are doing. And maybe, Rachel, you could be able to share what the dream is.
Thank you so much. The panelists have properly articulated everything. Probably just to add that prevention starts at the grassroots level. That is where we should be. We shouldn't be in a place where we are acting as a response. We should be able to nip this thing in the bud and be able to keep the best interests of the child as important and as paramount as possible. And also ensure that everyone knows their rights as an individual and as a community, because a child has his or her own rights.
Network.
And
she's back.
Oh,
proceed.
Sorry. Okay. I was saying that prevention is key, and prevention starts at the grassroots level. Yeah, we don't want a situation where we want to act as a response because my future, my idealistic future means that this child will be able to walk, will be able to make decisions by themselves without looking over their shoulder, that they have to provide for their families because of poverty, desperation, or maybe something else. And I would like a future where everyone is aware of their rights. As it was well articulated during the session, ignorance is no defense. Because if you find yourself, if you find that you have taken your child as a parent or as a community member to a situation where they will be put in harm's way, in terms of they will be either married off or something else, you will be held accountable as a parent and as a community. So being able to know your rights, being able to identify and be able to properly articulate and internalize those rights as a human being, even with the advent of our constitution and towards human dignity and everything else, will go a long way in protecting them. So I envision a situation where everyone will be able to know, no, this situation, this person should not be, this child should not be trafficked. They should be protected. This child has been taken to this area. I should be able to sound whistleblow or report these cases to the police in good time, working with communities in engaging them and being able to capacity build them and sensitize them on how they can be able to articulate their rights and internalize them as persons who can actually own them. I envision that future, and I pray it comes to that. Thank you.
And we hope we all get to live our dream and be able to see this come to life, as we've been able to, all of us, articulate, looking at where we see ourselves going and what we'd want to see with regards to protection for children and also even preventing child trafficking. And I think just to add that this is not where we end the conversation. We continue the discussion online. Currently, you are able to watch this through Heart's YouTube page. You're able to follow through Heart's Facebook page. But then again, we have these panelists who are supporting the cause and working for different organizations, really working in the same field as well. So maybe for us to continue with the discussion, and I'll ask everyone just to share, how can we reach you if you want to be able to continue the discussion? Maybe Rachel, because you just paused, you could be the first one to share. How can we continue the discussion? How do we get hold of you? If anyone wants to be able to get more information on what you've been able to discuss. Rachel?
Thank you, Winnie. As you introduced us, I'm a legal officer at Heart. You can come to our offices, contact us. We are on social media platforms everywhere. And we are there for you as a community. And we are there for you to provide you with the appropriate support that you would need in case issues of or cases of trafficking arise. So feel free to contact us. This is not the only conversation that will be there. We shall be always holding this conversation. There'll be always criminal enterprises trying to do trafficking crimes, and we shall be there to represent you in cases of trafficking as well. So feel free to communicate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Madam Grace, how do we get hold of you? How do we continue the discussion with ILO?
No, unataka kuendea?
Thank you so much, Winnie.
Namaliza 5. Watakula nini wakikuja? Kuna mayai 3.
Apologies for the disruption. I think this is Madam Josephine.
Rehema. Okay, thank you so much, Winnie. Like I introduced myself at the beginning, I work for the ILO and I'm managing this regional project. I'm based in Nairobi. Ideally, I should be at the Gigiri compound, the UN compound. But since last year, we've been working from home, but we can be reached on email. We have a website where you can also get materials concerning the issues, the the legal instruments, the work we do. We'll be very happy to continue this conversation throughout this year. It is important that we link child labor trafficking and forced labor. But also I call upon all of you who are on the call to join us in commemorating the World Day against child labor. There are several events that are happening on the 11th, on Friday. We have a virtual event with the policymakers. We shall send a link to you so that you can listen in, ask questions. We'll have the Department of Labor, Department of Children's Services, the employers represented by the Federation of Kenya Employers, the workers, the ILO, discussing the recent statistics that will be released on tomorrow. The global statistics on child labor will be released tomorrow. It is still under embargo, but it would be very interesting for you to see how the numbers have risen, which is really a pity. In real terms, may not show for Kenya, but generally sub-Saharan Africa, we are doing badly. And therefore, this discussion comes at a very timely, is very timely because it's at a time when all this, in the midst of the COVID-19, there's a lot happening. And so you are welcome to have more discussions. Let's see how we can work together. The ILO and other UN agencies are really at hand always to share information, to collaborate, and we'll be happy to carry on this conversation. Once again, thank you, Winnie. Thank you for letting us in this discussion. It's been very, very enriching. Mr. Gitau, thank you for sharing. Rachel, I look forward to connect with you, and Michelle, and for you, Winnie, we are always together. Thank you once again.
Thank you very much, Grace. You know where to find you, and we are expectant to hear what the results are. Looking forward to getting the results tomorrow on really what the survey states. Michelle, how do we get hold of you?
Great, thank you. Yeah, we can get a hold of us at stahilifoundation.org. We're on social media. Our phone numbers to our offices in Kenya. We work with a number of partners, and you're always welcome to reach out to us. Questions on alternative care, trafficking to orphanages, or otherwise, we are always here. And one thing we take a very strong ethos: if we don't know the answer, we will certainly work with wonderful partners like Madam Grace and others to direct you to the right place. That's www.stahili.org. And we're absolutely here to help. We're looking forward, Madam Grace, to the figures coming out tomorrow. And I guess calling on all partners on this call to share those figures so we can continue this incredibly important discussion, and looking forward to continuing the discussion with those on the call and otherwise. Thank you so much to Heart Kenya, to the IOM, to DCI, and to others involved in this. Thank you for having us here today.
Thank you very much, Michelle. And finally, hearing from Mr. Gitau.
Thank you, Winnie, and thank you so much to all the contributors. Thank you, Madam Grace. Thank you, Rachel. I look forward to having more engagement with all the contributors. I look forward to hearing from the members of the communities and exchanging notes on the progress that we'll make in the next meeting. One, my reiteration is for people to report. We have a hotline. The number is 0800 722 203. I'm based at DCI Child Protection Unit at South Sea, DCI Academy in South Sea, or what is commonly known as CID Training School. You're welcome any day for tea and exchanging notes. It's a walk-in policy for us, and our doors are open to all, whether it's to exchange on knowledge and also, but also to report cases that you may come across so as
Sorry, Winnie, I think I lost you for a while. I was requesting if Mr. Gitau can share the hotline number.
The hotline number is 0800 722 203.
Thank you, Mr. Gitau.
Thank you, Madam Grace.
Thank you very much. Now I'm wondering if you had lost me or you had lost Mr. Guitar, because I dropped off also for a second there. But I was just saying thank you for everyone for being able to join us, looking at the panelists, Madam Grace Banya, Madam Rachel Ngumi, Madam Michelle Oliel, and Mr. Gitau. Thank you for joining us and being able to share with us your wealth of experience. I think it was very helpful and has helped us to really delve deeper into the issue, understanding what's happening and what we're able to do to prioritize looking at performing on our efforts. Mr. Gitau, you could mute. You can still hear you. Okay. Thank you. And so I think as we wrap it up, just from me to mention that we are having this series in partnership with Stop the Traffic Kenya, Tangaza University, and the Trafficking in Persons Secretariat. And so looking forward to meeting the audience again on the 23rd of June as we get to delve deeper on sex trafficking in Kenya. And so with that, we'd like to thank everyone. Wish everyone a lovely, lovely evening, and see you. And thank you and bye.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye,
Bye.
Winnie.
Thank
Bye,
you.
Rachel.
Thank you too.
Bye, Michelle. Bye, Rachel.
Bye.
Bye.
Ciao. Bye.